The year is 283 AD, and a new emperor has ascended to the throne of the once great Roman Empire. The chaos of the preceding century has left the empire weak, and Diocletian faces his greatest challenge in the east, the Sassanid Empire, where the Persian king Shapur I had previously enslaved a Roman emperor, using him as a footstool before flaying him alive. Against all odds, Diocletian had an idea to save the empire. He would divide it into 4 equal parts, each ruled by a different ruler, and from this, a new political system known as the Tetrarchy was born. He would also redistribute the Roman army, moving it around into places where it had once been dominant, and in fact bringing it back to one of the most arid locations on the face of the earth. You can imagine the reaction a Roman soldier might have looking out at the Wadi Araba in modern Jordan today. It's known for its earthquakes, bitter waters, and scorching heat. This region has sometimes been described as extreme desert. Today, this area is characterized even further by saline mudflats, ferocious winds, and deep sand dunes. And in the middle lies the site of Ayn Gharandal.
Now, people frequently ask us why in the world we would choose to excavate and in fact bring students to such an inhospitable landscape. Now, most Americans are aware of conflict in the Middle East, but very few of us understand the complex power dynamics that govern how the ruled and the rulers interact, and especially how they do so in marginal, arid environments. Our job is to try and understand modern conflict while understanding past conflict. So by studying the Roman occupation and administration of what is still today an incredibly important little strip of land, we hope to have a better understanding of conflict over a vast period of time. Now, despite what you might have heard, history, in fact, is incredibly important. And it's not simply irrelevant to what we do today, it in fact informs what we do today. Now, the United States Millennium Project has identified what we'll call 15 global challenges that are threatening humanity's future. And among them are such problems including sustainable development and climate change, peace and conflict, democratization, the status of women. It may surprise you to learn that archaeologists are studying exactly the same issues. And it's our contention that if we want to understand what's happening today, we have to understand what's happened yesterday and the days before. By providing you with what we'll call a deep time perspective, we hope to be better equipped to handle these challenges tomorrow. Now, we are not the first Westerners to visit this site. In fact, we are preceded by 2 very important people. In 1902, the Czech explorer Alois Musil came to Ayn Gharandal as part of an ethnographic survey of Arabia. Following hard on his heels, Lawrence of Arabia, who you might have heard of, came in 1912. And now neither of them had anything especially positive to say about the site. In fact, Lawrence comments on the brackish water, the unfit landscape, and he calls Ayn Gharandal a land fit only for camels. Ironically, though both of these men were scientists and scholars, and in Lawrence's case an archaeologist, the work that they did at Ayn Gharandal would end up being used in military conflict, and the men would find themselves on opposite sides of World War I. Now, there hadn't been work at Ayn Gharandal beyond Lawrence and Alois Musil since 1902. In 2009, something very important happened. In 2009, we recognized that the site of Ayn Gharandal was being looted, and what you can see before you on the image are the piles of looters' debris that occurred whenever the excavation dug through, the illicit excavation dug through the, what we now know as the bathhouse. Additionally, they added a light pole right in the middle of one of the most important structures at the site. It became very clear at that point that if we were going to save Ayn Gharandal for the future and learn anything about the past, it would have to be excavated. And the Ayn Gharandal Archaeological Project was born. What we uncovered was simply astonishing. Underneath those sands, those inhospitable sands, lies 3 meters of pristine Roman structure.
Since 2009, at Ayn Gharandal, we have excavated a number of impressive ancient Roman buildings, including a Roman bathhouse. The bathhouse, which you see on the screen, it contained several different rooms. One is the tepidarium, the image that had with the showing the floor with the hole in it that the looters had disturbed. And you can see it in the image. The caldarium, which is the hottest room, which contains the large hot tub visible in the upper right image. And in both of these rooms, you can see that in the walls, we have a completely intact heating system. Clay pipes and bricks under the floor raised the floor up, allowing heat to come in through the furnace, which lay immediately to the south, which is the lower image. To the west of these rooms, we uncovered the frigidarium, or the cold room of the bath. And south of that, a room with a finely paved floor with 2 deep channels running along its walls. These were in fact water channels, and the room is a latrine or bathroom. It's so well preserved, in fact, that we could see the line of the wooden benches that once abutted the plastered mud brick wall of the room. Just to the north of these rooms were a paved courtyard that contained fountains, and to the west, a room that we recently uncovered that we think may be part of a caravan trading post. But the most astonishing find from the bathhouse were a series of pictorial and textual graffiti. That is, we had Greek texts, as well as images of ships and cartoons, you might call, of camels, and images of naked male bathers. The most spectacular of these was found last summer, which was an image of a Roman deity, the goddess Fortuna or Isis, a common figure found in Roman military baths across the empire. Even more curious was the presence of an early Christian symbol, the Chi-Rho, which you can see in the image on the right towards the bottom.
So, moving on to the fort, we excavated along several of the defensive walls, and what you see here are a row of rooms that's along the northern defensive wall of the fort. Now, in these rooms, we found the best evidence for domestic occupation, stuff from everyday life, what people ate, what pots they used, how they cooked, including several complete vessels, which is always really exciting to find in an excavation. You can also see in the picture in front of you a bone pin and a metal makeup applicator. That was a surprise. Were there women at the fort at Ayn Gharandal? Only the future will tell us. Now, moving to the western wall, we have uncovered the remains of scores of burials. This is at a very high elevation, so close to the surface. And it turns out that Ayn Gharandal, after it was abandoned by the Romans, was reused as a fairly extensive cemetery. Carbon-14 dates indicate for over 300 years, during almost the entire Islamic periods. Now, once you get underneath the human excavation, or the human burials, what you find, at least along the western wall, is a monumental room. It is built beautifully. You can see in the picture before you stone piers with a raised ceiling, of course missing now. We imagined that this was the officers' quarters, but we weren't sure. In 2011, we got our answer. Here you see Abby Turner sitting next to the remains of wall plaster that had collapsed in antiquity. Now, you can't pick up the wall plaster and expose it to the sun or it will bleach white. So we didn't find out for 4 months that what we actually had were 20 lines of Greek text, including a narrative about the Roman army and a list of names, many of which were probably of local Nabatean descent. So it tells us a story about how the garrison incorporated local inhabitants into the military. And here you can see, briefly, a picture of that inscription. Now, in 2015, we had yet another surprise. Outside of this room, the officers' quarters, we found an apsidal building. Now, there are only so many things an apsidal building can be in the 4th century. And it is our contention, and I think supported by the data, that what we have is a very early Christian church. Obviously, you can see from the picture on the lower right that we have a lot of work to do. We've only uncovered the smallest bit. But in 2017, we expect to excavate the entire building. and are very, very excited. Now, of course, this corroborates what we knew from the bathhouse, that Cairo, indicating that at least before the end of the 4th century, some, if not many, of our soldiers at Ayn Gharandal had converted to Christianity.
Finally, excavations along the eastern wall of the fort revealed the remains of the fort's main gate. And you can see that in the image here, as we found it, not counting the SEC flags, of course. The gate had been altered in antiquity and narrowed into a single passageway with a raised up threshold stone, indicating different phases of use at the site. But what was most spectacular were, one, the discovery of another of these pottery assemblages right outside the gate, and then we uncovered the almost perfectly preserved remains of a collapsed arch that went over the main gate. On top of this, lying face down in the sand, as you can see in the image with the team who discovered it, was a large block of limestone with a building inscription. The inscription was covered in sand, and we immediately brought it up to the conservation labs of the American Center of Oriental Research in Amman. And after it was cleaned, we could read it. And this was the big story of the year. The inscription tells us, in fact, that the fort was built by the Emperor Diocletian and his co-emperors, the Tetrarchy. But more than that, it named the specific army unit that had been stationed there, the Cohors to Galatarum, or the second cohort of Galatians. This unit is mentioned elsewhere in ancient historical documents as one of the units that was brought in the 2nd century to the region to help suppress the Second Jewish Revolt. Further, from the inscription, we were able to find out the name of the site in antiquity, which was Ariel-Dela. So, Ayn Gharandal has already helped us understand the complex nature of power relations within the region. Rome's choice of this spot to co-opt the water source indicates that this outpost was not an inn for weary travelers, but the presence of locals among the list of names found in the officers' quarters argues instead that the locals weren't shunned, they were actually being included. In fact, these inhabitants were likely of Nabatean descent. As you can see on the image, we made famous by the nearby site of Petra. Again, what you see here are students, not Nabateans. And the evidence so far suggests that this imperial policy was successful for the empire in some ways and not so much in others. For example, Rome's integration of local populations, at least those around Ariel-Dela, may have avoided open conflict and succeeded in protecting an important trade route from the Red Sea to the Mediterranean. But the garrison seems to have operated with a mixed population, possibly integrating multiple religious identities as well.
And while that's true, at the same time, the site was only in existence for 60 years. It's a mere blip of archaeological time, which tells us that some of those policies didn't work all that well in the long run. Now think about the amount of resources, energy, time, money that Rome would have invested in building not just Ariel-Dela, but all of the forts around this region, and for them to simply wither away back into the desert sand after a single occupation. So what went wrong?
One explanation for this is that the same techniques of domination that Rome used to control the regional population were in fact responsible for the site's downfall. The army co-opted the only water source and displayed that power conspicuously by building a bathhouse, a structure that surely seemed amiss to the local inhabitants who had lived for millennia in a desert environment lacking rainfall. This strategy would have allowed Rome to control all of the travelers and merchants in the area, but surely ultimately damaged the delicate environmental balance.
Now, in addition to water, the location of our structures is somewhat problematic. The dominance of the fort, its location out into the Wadi system, as you can see by this image, would have allowed Rome to easily control the roadways. However, You can see from this image drawn by Musil already in 1902, it also puts their structures in the immediate floodplain for any kind of flash flooding coming through the wadi in any direction. And in fact, we have evidence at the site of some of this kind of massive flooding after occupation. Not only do they have to worry about the water, but they had to worry about the sand. Wadi Gharandal is now in a sand dune sea. And even in the ancient period, we have evidence to suggest that they were constantly fighting sand accumulation. No self-respecting Nabatean would have built these kinds of structures in such a difficult environment. And in fact, we have every reason to believe that what Rome did that would have worked ultimately led to the site's failure, because they underestimated the importance of the natural environment and how it would impact and interact with Roman imperial building strategy. And these are not new problems. These are the same issues we have even today. We are, at this very moment, discussing conflict, management of inhabitants, and depleted natural resources in exactly the same part of the world, a part of the world that is a linchpin for peace and democracy well outside the Middle East. Now, in addition to studying conflict and resource management in the past, the Ayn Gharandal Archaeological Project seeks to create bridges in the present. And how do we do that? By bringing a team of students, researchers, and graduate students of an international proportion altogether. Ayn Gharandal, as you can see from the image, is in fact a family business. But we've constructed a team representing 17 different institutions, 4 different countries. I think it's fair to say that running the Ayn Gharandal Archaeological Project is itself an exercise in international diplomacy. Now, since 2013, UT students have joined the party, and since 2013 and 2015, they spent 5 weeks in the deserts of Jordan, working side by side with Jordanians, learning about a culture very different from their own, learning about archaeology, and having a life-changing experience. And this isn't just about student learning. This is also about students giving back. How do we defeat the forces of conflict and of estrangement? Well, we create relationships. We create relationships between students. We create relationships between countries. And as a result of our students from UT being in Jordan, Jordan is a better country. They have stronger relationships. And what happens when the students come back is even more impressive. Our students, since coming back to the University of Tennessee, have met with politicians, local and regional, in the state capitol, here locally. They have spearheaded efforts to teach young children about archaeology. They are aiding and abetting in the creation of Arab Fest every year and volunteering their time. They are raising money for refugees overseas. They are working all over campus to give back here in East Tennessee. And that's what conflict prevention and conflict resolution is really about, not just in Jordan, but here at home as well.
I guess in closing, we would like to thank the University of Tennessee for their continual support of our project, and the Department of Antiquities of Jordan, with whom we've worked for so many years. But most of all, we would like to give special thanks to all of the students who have come with us and helped us and made this project possible. And we hope to see some of you with us in 2017.
Yeah.